Hello again. This is part two of Unit 2 summary. Want to talk about the last question in your Unit 2 exam, which talks about our founding fathers. As I had said before, all of the things that I will share with you is on Blackboard, and um, this particular PowerPoint is, I think, in week 7. So we're going to talk about our founding fathers. Who are these guys, and what exactly what do they have in common, and what did they individually bring to the table? Um, the first thing I want to talk about is what they have in common. What is their general makeup? Basically speaking, these are guys that are pretty well off. They have plantations or law businesses, or they have money in their pocket, and that's going to come into play big time. But at any rate, so these are men of the Enlightenment, as we already talked about before. They believed in government and the fact that the government exists for the good of the people. We call them Republican gentlemen, and we need to differentiate between Republican as in the party and Republican as in the ideology. We are talking about Republican, in this case, as Republicans as an ideology. So if you see capital R, it just happens to start with a capital R because it's the start of a sentence, but if you see a capital R, that's usually talking about the party, the Republican Party. You see a small r, or if you hear somebody talking and saying, yeah, I want to talk about, Republican small r, what they're talking about is, I want to talk about the philosophy or the ideology of republicanism. So these are Republican gentlemen. That tells us two things. One is that they have sufficient wealth. Why is that important? Well, because how on earth, you ever stop to think about this? How on earth can George Washington, for example, leave his plantation, go off and fight a war, and then get involved in the Articles of Confederation, then get involved in the Constitution? I mean, he literally was away from his plantation, I'm going to say probably 30 years. How is that possible? Well, it's possible because he is a gentleman, in the sense that those plantations that he has are going to continue to make money whether he's there or not. So he can afford to go out and to do all these great things that he did. Same thing is true with all of our founding fathers. So and not only that, not only can he afford it, but he can be devoted on a full-time basis to his goal in his country. So this idea of being able to afford being able to afford doing this has something to do with what we call disinterested. These guys are disinterested. And I'm sure that kind of, has people saying, what? What are you talking about? Disinterested. Obviously, they were interested in creating our government. That's not what we're talking about here. Disinterested means that they have no personal aggrandizement. They're not in this for their own personal gain. They're not trying to make any money from creating this government because they don't need it. They already have it. So this is a very important part of being a good founding father. These are guys who are Republican, which means that they believe in a government that exists for the people, not for their own personal gain, and they have no skin in the game as far as money is concerned. So they can make decisions that are based on what's good for the people, not what's good for themselves. What else can we say about these guys? They believed in a world controlled by the meritocracy rather than the aristocracy. In other words, we are going to pick our leaders based on what they can do, what are their accomplishments, what are their ideas, rather than what is their social status or social rank. Remember, they're coming from Great Britain. When you're, I mean, either you're born into wealth or you're born into poverty. There's no movement in or out of either one of those. The leadership was always, you know, like Parliament was always the well-to-do. These people believed that the way we pick leaders is by what they contribute, their merit, their ability to help our society. And they were all keenly aware of their obligation to serve and the importance of their work. So they understood that they were movers and shakers in this, what we call New World Order. We're starting something new. We're starting something exciting. We're young, we're vital, we're energetic. We're going to take Enlightenment philosophy and we're going to push it as far as we possibly can. So that's what these guys look like. They were wealthy, they were educated, they understood the Enlightenment and the whole movement involved with the Enlightenment. They understood that they had an important role in putting this all together if it was going to work. One of the things that many of you came up with, which is absolutely true, is that these guys, in a way, are creating their own aristocracy. In other words, their belief system was that the government should be operated by intelligent, educated, well-to-do kinds of people, white males. The role of female and poor and all that, they were not thought of in this new government that they wanted to create. So in reality, did they really create a democracy? The answer to that is kind of, but not exactly. Bottom line is, as I gave you the last summary, these guys are a little bit concerned about what's going to happen. Are we going to allow the mob to take over? And they didn't see that as a very positive thing, because obviously the mob, mob control, not real good necessarily anyway. Okay, so let's move onward and upward. Let's talk about George Washington. We'll start with him. George Washington is an extremely important choice for the first presidency of the United States. And the reason why is because, again, there is this massive fear that somebody is going to take over and they're going to make themselves a king or a dictator, just like human history has shown us time and time again. So the choice for this first leader, this first president, has to be somebody that everybody can trust. And that's where George Washington comes into play. If there is one attribute that is extremely important about George Washington, it is the fact that most people throughout all 13 states knew George Washington, trusted George Washington. Now, look, we know that George Washington was the head of the Continental Army during the American Revolution. But what we need to understand is that when the American Revolution is over, George Washington hangs up his uniform and goes home. This says a lot about the man. This is not a man that, has gained power and he wants power. This is a guy that says, "Here you go. I helped out. Now I'm going home." It plays a big role in who George Washington is. People really understand that he is that kind of guy. All right, what else can we say? He looks presidential. He's for his time very large, very big, very tall, and uh, very physically strong, and looks the part. Um, he's also very important because he's right in this whole thing from the very beginning. He was at the Continental Congress. He was at the Constitutional Convention, which created this new government. He was the president, if you will, of the new Constitutional Convention. So he was right there when they created it. He understood what the founding fathers had in mind when they created it. He understood the kind of government that they created. Um, and so he obviously could step right in and say, okay, yeah, now I know what the government's supposed to do. And so I could step right in. He is the embodiment of those people that I just talked about. He is a Republican, he has Republican virtue. In other words, he believes that the government official, if he's the president, that he exists for the benefit of the people. He's only there because the people allow him to be there. And when his job is done, he's going to go home. He's not going to create some sort of dictatorship. That is really important in a really uh, nervous society. People worried, very, very worried about somebody taking over, getting right back to square one again. The last thing is that he is a strong federalist. And if you did your homework, your last homework, you know that a federalist is a person who has very strong beliefs in a central government. Power should be in the hands of the central government, and a strong belief in this concept of nationalism, not 13 separate countries, but a nation called the United States of America. And of course, this is going to be really important to push this country forward and to give legitimacy to a national government that people simply didn't trust. He puts trust into the central government. When his 4 years is up, he was ready to go home. He was sick and tired of all of it. He wanted to go home. His Federalist companions, guys like Hamilton, which we'll talk about, told him, "Listen, we're not done cooking the cake. This experiment is still not solidified. We still need you here to really solidify this whole concept. So please stay another term." And so very reluctantly, Washington said, "Okay, fine, I'll serve a second term." And when that term was over, of course, he walked away. Which leads us to, let me go back to this. Model of disinterest. All of his decisions were based on the good of the country, not on his own personal gains. Only founding father to actually free his slaves. Not all the slaves in his plantations were freed because his wife owned the slaves that were brought over from her family. We will refer to slavery as the peculiar institution, but he thought it was immoral. I would suggest to you that the most important thing that George Washington did and sends a signal to the world that this is going to work is that when he resigns his presidency after 8 years, he turns to John Adams, who was elected president in the next let's see, it would be 1796. He turns to John Adams and says, "Hey, John, congratulations," shakes his hand. "You're now the president," walks away. Holy mackerel. This is nothing has ever happened. Once somebody gets power, they never let go of it. As Rousseau said, power corrupts. Absolute power corrupts absolutely. This experiment is going to work. We actually have a guy who shakes hands with the next guy who comes in, who assumes power. This is mind-boggling to the rest of Europe. They were fairly sure that the experiment was not going to work. And that what would happen is George Washington would make himself King George I of the Americas. And obviously that didn't happen. So this is really, when we say that George Washington was a major component of our country, it is absolutely true. Okay, so I have some other stuff here that's I should have moved around in my PowerPoint. I need to go back to these founding fathers again. Sorry about that. So we know that the Declaration of Independence says, okay, we're all equal, we're all free, that we all have rights and no one can take away from us, and the government gets its power from the consent of the governed, all that cool stuff. And that became the call to the poor man, the guy on the farm, to go get your musket and come join George Washington in fighting the British. Because when this is done, this is the kind of society that we're going to create. So why did the farmer pick up his gun and go fight the British? Because of the Declaration of Independence and the promise that he would be just as equal to anybody else. Well, as I was telling you before, the founding fathers didn't, they thought, oh my God, what did we create? Is this really what we want to do? So founding fathers believed that the people would choose the wisest, most disinterested, most intellectual men among them. But what they were finding out very quickly was that they were easily swayed by these ordinary guys, these crooks and these medicine men who were only looking out for themselves. In their lifetime, they saw these people, these farmers, whoever, these poor people who were choosing the wrong people. They weren't choosing the meritocracy. They thought that's what they were going to do. They're going to say, oh yeah, this guy is really, he's intelligent, he's smart, he's got money, let's make him our representative. That wasn't happening. These farmers were picking, the farmer next door, which for us may sound pretty good, but for them, that was a disaster. Now all of a sudden Congress is filled with these local yokels that don't know shit from Shinola. So before they died, the country was run by, according to James Madison, social inferiors such as uneducated printers, shop boys, and raw schoolmasters. So, Declaration has declared that all men are created equal. Now the people took that very literally. I, the dock worker, am just as good as you, Mr. Jefferson. Founding fathers' concept of republic run by gentlemen is now going to be destroyed right again before they even die. The mob had taken control of the asylum. And so now the common man begins to hate the founding fathers because they see them as being too elitist. Oh, you think you're smarter than me. You think that just because you're rich and you understand, you read books and all this other stuff, I'm smart too, that kind of attitude. So when we look at what America comes to, not exactly what the founding fathers had in mind. So when you see somebody saying, "What did the founding fathers have in mind?" This is, we need to continue on with what we're doing because this is what the founding fathers had in mind. No, that's not what they had in mind. They had in mind that rich, intelligent people like themselves were going to be able to run the whole deal. Okay. So let's get back to different individuals. Thomas Jefferson. Thomas Jefferson is the third president of the United States. Washington was the first. John Adams the second. Thomas Jefferson is the third. Thomas Jefferson was the Secretary of State under George Washington and the vice president under John Adams. So what was Jefferson like as a president? The answer to that is not very good. And one of the reasons why is because of the philosophy that you learned in your homework assignment, which is part of the Democratic Republican Party, which he was basically the starter of, that we don't need a strong central government, that governments in the states should basically rule everything. And he didn't believe in having like a military or anything like that. So all the things that John Adams, a Federalist, started to consolidate into the national government are now being taken apart by Jefferson. But he is the writer of the Declaration of Independence, which we hold very, very dearly, of course. Again, as we talked about before, it is the expression of the American mind. I don't think we need to go through all of that. Okay, so Jefferson believed that all power should lie in the hands of the people, trusted people to choose their representatives properly, believed that all power should be local, central government should have very limited power, believed that this country should remain agricultural, and he basically disliked the people up north, basically, who he called men of paper. In other words, these are guys who made money by shuffling paper around, the bankers, the lawyers, and all those kinds of people. He believed in a strict interpretation of the Constitution, which I'll talk about later on. So that's going to, his ideas are going to create what we call the Republican Democratic Party. While I'm there, I just wanted to tell you, please do not confuse Jefferson's Republican Party with the Republican Party that we have today. And we've had all kinds of switches back and forth throughout the 200 plus years of our country. The Republican, as we'll find out in the 1830s, the Republican Party is going to be dropped off and they'll be called the Democratic Party. Hopefully we understand that Democrats in general believe in the common dude and don't like central government telling us what to do. That, I mean, that's, everything is kind of in flux right now, but that's the way it should, that's the way it has been in the past. At any rate, moving right along. Alexander Hamilton got recognition because of the Broadway musical, of course, but I would dare say that most people never heard of Alexander Hamilton before him. And what's really strange about it is that Alexander Hamilton, probably one of the most important founding fathers of all of them, because he was made the Secretary of Treasury by George Washington. You need to hopefully remember that under the Articles of Confederation government, the economy is in the toilet. And so Washington turns to Alexander Hamilton and says, okay, how do we get out of the toilet? Um, and so Alexander Hamilton comes up with 3 different plans that help us to get out of the toilet. But what I want you to understand is that he is one of these very elitist kinds of guys. Most people didn't like Hamilton because he was so elitist. He didn't believe that people could choose good leaders. As Secretary of the Treasury, he guides a country towards being industrial and commercial. And that's why the North becomes very industrial and commercial. He believes that all power should be in the hands of the federal government, especially in the hands of the president. If it was up to him, the president would have a lifetime term. He believed in loose interpretation of the Constitution, which I want to discuss a little bit later on. And basically, it's his ideas that will create the Federalist Party. So, in other words, as soon as this new government is created, we begin to have these divides between, what is the real role of this central government, this federal government. Should it have all the power, or should it have no power? How do we figure all of that out? And let's move onward and upwards. So basically, what we have is 2 men who will eventually create a political party. Now, these men would never, ever agree if you walked up to them and said, hey, you created this particular party. They would probably challenge you to a duel and shoot you in the ass, because political parties is a no-no. Political parties are in England, and these guys are, behind closed doors, scheming about what are we going to do next. Political parties are not disinterested people. They have their own interests at heart. The reason why we have a Republican Party is because all the people who believe, in in how this government's supposed to act, join that party. Why? Because I want certain things out of my government. That makes sense. So it's not what's good for everybody, what's good for the people, Republican for the people. It is, political parties suggest that, as I said, they have their own personal agendas. But at any rate, the conversation between the two ends, and the followers that follow those two will end up creating the two political parties that we have today. All right, so let's look at the difference in the two. Jefferson is from the South. He's a Virginia planter farmer, and his prime goal for the country is to continue on as an agrarian country. He believes that the farmers are the salt of the earth, and let's stay agriculture. He believes that the power should be in the hands of the state, not in the federal government. And I want you to think about this. If you are a farmer, what kind of government do you want? Are you interested in all of these, foreign affair kinds of things, and infrastructure, and all this? No. What you want to know is, can I have a government that will stand guard in front of my farm and take and protect it? And that's done by local governments, by state governments, not by some faraway central government. So they believe that power should be in the hands of the states and the local governments, again, because that most suits the farming community. Strict interpretation of the Constitution, you guys have written about this, on your homework assignment, but not really expand on it at all. strict interpretation of the Constitution, or what we call the letter of the law, simply says that the federal government can only do those things that specifically say you can do. And you can't vary from that. You can't just go out and do whatever you damn well please. You got to stick to exactly the powers given to you by the Constitution. This fits right into this idea that we want to keep tabs on, or we want to monitor this strong central government, not make it too strong. We don't want it to get carried away. So we're going to have a very strict interpretation of the Constitution. So he's going to create the Democratic Republican Party, and believed in the least amount of governing over individualism. The expression that he used was the government that governs least governs best. Okay, on the other side, we have Alexander Hamilton. He is a New York lawyer, financier. He's the money guy. His prime goal of the country thinks that we should be industrial and commercial. He sees England as moving toward the Industrial Revolution, and he thinks that the United States needs to jump onto that train. So he believes that the majority of power should be in the hands of the federal government, not in the states. Now, stop to think about this. If I am making products, industrial products, and I want to ship them to another country, I need strong federal laws. I need strong federal support in order to be able to put it on a ship and cross over the ocean and deal with these other countries. It's a whole different mindset about what the government needs to do. In order to get into industrialization and commercialization, you've got to have a strong central government. What follows in line with that is a very loose interpretation of the Constitution, or what's called the spirit of the law. In other words, we can't just say, well, it doesn't say you can't do it. If it's good, if it's a good policy, if it's something that helps people, then we should be able to do it. It's a very loosey-goosey kind of attitude. Yeah, go ahead, make any laws you want to, it's okay. What's interesting is that in the Constitution, it does say in Article 1, Section 8, the last power granted to Congress is what we call the elastic clause, or the necessary and proper clause. In other words, it gives the power to Congress to make any laws that they see as being necessary and proper for it to carry out its job. That's very loosey-goosey. And that's what's going to be used as we move on. We'll see that elastic clause is going to be used very famously by a guy by the name of John Marshall in the Supreme Court. So let me see if I can give you an example. I have a daughter when she was just in high school driving to work, and her contact lenses were hurting her, so she took them out. She went to work at a restaurant where she washed dishes, and she was coming home late, like 2 o'clock in the morning, and the policeman stopped her and said, "Hey, you're going across the line in the center of the road, and have you been drinking?" She said, "No, I just can't see very well because of my contact lenses." So anyways, make a short story long, what happens is that my daughter ends up going to court with a ticket for crossing over the center line. And so I went in front of the judge and with my daughter, and I said, "Look, I understand the law, you can't cross over, but she was having sight problems. She wasn't intentionally trying to cross over the line. Well, I have a loose interpretation of the law, or what we call the spirit of the law. The spirit of the law is to keep people on the right-hand side of the road. I understand that. However, there are times when that's not possible. if I'm driving down the street and a kid comes running out into the street to catch their ball, and I swerve and go out into the other lane, am I going to get a ticket for that? I mean, obviously, there are times when you need to do that sort of thing. And so that's the spirit of the law. However, the judge didn't see it that way. The judge is a strict interpreter of the law and goes by the letter of the law, puts her hammer down and says, you're guilty, and charges her like $50 fine or some crazy thing like that. So that's the difference. The judge is a letter of the law person and strict interpretation. I was a spirit of the law, loose interpretation. Okay, so hopefully we get that. So Alexander Hamilton basically saying we need to be loosey-goosey. If we're going to move forward, we have to keep asking ourselves what's good for the people. Don't worry about whether it's in the Constitution or not. And that, as I'm sure you found out, or at least should have found out, is going to get into some big court issues, which we'll talk about in a minute. All right, so he and his followers create the Federalist Party. Again, Federalist Party, very strict, very urban, big city, industrialization, shipping, stuff like that. That's basically his bailiwick. Thomas Jefferson, farmer, represents the farmers of the country. Okay. So what does Alexander Hamilton do that is famous for him is he creates, excuse me, he creates three proposals. One is to consolidate all of the war debts, and the other is to tax people so that they can pay off those war debts, and the third is to create a national bank to process the transactions. I don't want to get too involved in all of this, but needless to say, those states that had very little fighting in the revolution had very little debt. Most of the debt was in the northern states where most of the war, the American Revolution, was fought. So we're helping out for the most part, northern states pay off their war debts. But it's not just states, they're also paying off France that lent us a huge amount of money, Spain and the Netherlands that lent us huge amounts of money. And it's fairly simple, guys. Look, if you want foreign countries to buy our products or to do trade kinds of things and to make money, you gotta instill trust. Yeah, we will pay you back. Simple as that. The taxes, again, huge issue. That's the reason why we went to the American Revolution in the first place. Wait a minute. We just fought an American Revolution and it says that we protest taxing. Well, the key here is that it's taxing, but you have representation. You have somebody in Congress that's going to represent you. It's okay to tax. It's okay to get money into the coffers of the federal government so they could pay their debts. Because in the long run, if the government goes bankrupt, so do you. It's really the bottom line. Okay, let's see, what else we got? All right, moving on. James Madison, we call James Madison the father of the American Constitution. He's the guy who, as I've already mentioned, comes to the Constitutional Convention with this new plan, the Virginia plan, in his pocket. And basically that's what the convention talked about the rest of the summer, his plan, his Virginia plan. And all of the debate that happened all revolved around this Virginia plan. During the ratification of this new Constitution, he is one of the collaborators of what we call the Federalist Papers, which basically is writing articles in the newspaper about why we need this new government. Federalist Papers are extremely important if we want to understand what the Founding Fathers had in mind. They were written primarily by Hamilton. I didn't put that in the Hamilton slide. Most of the writing was done by Hamilton, but James Madison was also a very big contributor, and a guy by the name of John Jay, who was the first head of the Supreme Court. If you ever want to know what the Founding Fathers had in mind, all you have to do is pick up the Federalist Papers and you'll know, because it is a collection of writings and considering the framework of the American political thought. Okay, so moving right along. Like his fellow Founding Fathers, he believed that the government would be controlled by the meritocracy of America. And again, by the time of the Constitution, lesser men had already taken over. His Virginia plan calls for two-house legislature that would be totally divorced from state governments. In other words, it was purely the meritocracy, we want to use aristocracy, the meritocracy that would run the country. This ensures that only the Republican gentleman would control the government, but again, by the time he dies, he sees this populist wave take over. And really, the final version is not really what Madison or the rest of the Founding Fathers had in mind. John Adams, as I said, first Vice President of the United States, second President of the United States, probably one of the least appreciated Founding Fathers, very misunderstood kind of guy. He was a grumpy old man kind of guy and didn't get along with a lot of people, but extremely intelligent and did a lot of work for the start of this country. He represented Massachusetts in the Second Continental Congress and pushed for independence. He was on the committee for the Declaration of Independence. During the war, he was an envoy to France and then eventually to the Netherlands to get money, to borrow money to help fight the American Revolution. Without that money, where were they going to get arms and ammunition and clothing and all that, food? Very, very critical part, but in the background, not getting a lot of accolades. I don't want to talk about the alien sedition. Yeah, so this is actually a copy of the slide that I already showed you, the differences between Jefferson and Madison, who create the Democratic Republican Party, and Hamilton and Adams that create the Federalist Party. Lastly, I want to talk a little bit about a guy by the name of John Marshall. John Marshall is not necessarily one of the Founding Fathers, but I considered him to be one. He is not in the Supreme Court, in the original Supreme Court that Washington put together, but will be put into office, I believe, by John Adams. So he's a Federalist. He believes in a strong central government. And if we look at what his court cases involve, it very much is wrapped around two basic concepts. One is this idea that the federal government is in a shaky place. People don't trust it. People are not sure how much power it should have, if any at all. And Marshall, like the Federalists in general, wanted to make sure that this federal government not only continued on, but maintained the power that it needed for it to do its job. Also, the things that the Supreme Court cases that he presided over moved the country in the direction of the Federalists. In other words, the United States, hopefully we know, becomes a very industrial, very commercial nation, the leader of the world eventually. It would not happen without decisions made by John Marshall and the others on the court. I don't want to I don't want to get too far into the court cases themselves, other than to give you a general idea of why the court case was important. I'm not going to talk about the court case. I'm just going to talk about why the court case is important. So 4 cases that we want to talk about: Marbury versus Madison, McCulloch versus Maryland, Fletcher versus Peck, and Gibbons versus Ogden. Marbury versus Madison is important. Again, the background is really not anything I want to get into, but what John Marshall did in this case is it nullified a law that was created by Congress and said it wasn't constitutional. This gives the Supreme Court its function, its interpretive function. They look at laws that were passed by Congress, signed by the president, and ask, and when challenged, these laws, when these laws are challenged, the Supreme Court decides whether those laws were constitutional. Did they have the right to make that law? This is called judicial review. This is really important, guys. Up until John Marshall, the Supreme Court, people in the Supreme Court really didn't know what the heck they were doing there. What is our function? Half the time they were sitting around in some pub drinking beer. So John Marshall gives us the function of the Supreme Court in this case. And so we call this court case a cornerstone case, a seminal case that basically gives the Supreme Court their role as a third branch of the federal government, which can check the power of the other 2. Extremely important, obviously. In the McCulloch versus Maryland case, one of the tenants that we talked about, Alexander Hamilton, wanted to create a national bank. When a guy by the name of McCulloch goes into Maryland to create this Bank of the United States, Maryland says, get the heck out of here. We don't want you in here. First of all, you have to follow Maryland banking laws. That banking is under the auspices of state power, not federal power. And tried to tax the crap out of the Bank of the United States. McCulloch refuses to pay the taxes to Maryland. The other thing that Maryland wants to prove in this court case is that the actual law that creates the bank is unconstitutional. There's nothing in the Constitution that says that the federal government has the right to create a bank. So 2 issues. Maryland believes that the Bank of the United States is unconstitutional, and that since the bank is in Maryland, that Maryland can control the Bank of the United States. So what does the court say? Bank of the United States is constitutional under the Elastic Clause. Why? Because it is necessary and proper for the government to carry out its job. This is the first time that a Supreme Court has sided with a law that is a spirit of the law. It is not specifically granted. Banking is not specifically granted. So the strict constitutionalists are going to lose on this thing. The loose interpretation people are going to win. Why? Because of the Elastic Clause, because of this necessary and proper clause. So that becomes a really important case, a benchmark case as well. Fletcher versus Peck has to do with the state of Georgia taking back a contract that the previous legislature had given. The importance of this case is that the federal court is going to tell Georgia, no, you can't just pull out of a contract. The contract is has sanctity. There is a holiness to the contract. Once you go into the contract, you can't just back out of it. You, Georgia, had a contract to sell this land. You have to follow through with your contract. So in a way, we have the federal government spanking a state. Naughty Georgia, you did the wrong thing. Give the guy back his land. This is, again, important because this is for two reasons. One is that now we know that we are protected against our own state, that the federal government will come to my individual rights when I have a problem with my own state. The other thing is extremely important is that because if we're going to move into industrialization and commercial ventures, contracts have to be followed. Nobody's going to go into a merger with somebody. Okay, I'm going to make 1,000 pairs of shoes without knowing that somebody's going to back up the contract. That if that guy says no, I'm not going to buy them after you made them, I can take him to court and say, hey, here's the contract. He told me he would buy 1,000 pairs of shoes, and that the government is going to say, hey, you went into this contract, pay the man for his shoes. Really important case, again, another benchmark case. In the Gibbons versus Ogden case, this has to do with right-of-way steamboats running around New York City to New Jersey, and contracts that the New York State had given to somebody to do that. Basically, the reason why this court case is important is because it says to the New York State, you don't control interstate commerce. One of the powers granted to the federal government in the Constitution is interstate commerce. As soon as the steamboat leaves your water, New York water, and goes into New Jersey water, that is interstate commerce. We will make regulations about that, not you. So hopefully you could see where the Marshall Court continuously gives more and more power to the federal government. Now, we could argue about, is that good or is that bad? But certainly it's essential to have a strong federal government, especially looking at our country today. I mean, how much power do we give the states today? They still have power, don't misunderstand me. They have certain powers. As we've seen in this COVID thing, here's a connection for you. As we've seen in this COVID thing, every governor's doing their own thing. I don't care what Mr. Trump says, this is what we're going to do. And Mr. Trump can say whatever he wants, but he has no power over what the governor of that state does. So there's a good example of a good connection of how this whole concept of federalism works. Let's see, I want to make sure that I covered all the bases for this test. Okay, the last part of it says, what actions did they take to make this country go in the direction that we went in? Hopefully, again, you understand that basically the Federalists under Washington and John Adams won the debate. We became a commercial industrial giant, and the federal government became strengthened as a result of their work. Now, again, we can argue whether that's good or bad, but that's the direction our country went in as a result of their work. So I guess that covers everything. I'm looking at the test as I'm sitting here. Yeah, I think I've covered everything I need to cover for this test. As always, if you have any questions or issues, please contact me. I'd be more than happy to discuss any of this stuff with you if it's unclear. There's a lot of stuff that I would have covered in a normal classroom that I didn't cover in this because it would make it way too long. Like my first summary, I noticed was almost an hour long. So we're going to cut this one shorter. And again, if you have any questions, problems, issues, I would be more than happy to chat with you. So have a good day, stay safe, and I look forward to seeing your Unit 2 exam that's going to be due this Friday.